Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AO 2020-99, reallocating and allocating CARES Act money in an amount of $61,586,186 to first responder payroll. Let's start with a roll call.
Mr. Rivera. Oh, I guess we're
Present.
supposed to be informal. Felix Rivera. Austin Davidson.
Here.
Jamie Allard.
Here.
Christopher Constant.
Here.
Horace Dunbar.
Here.
Crystal Kennedy.
Here.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Here.
Cameron Perez Verdia. Pete Peterson. John Weddleton.
Here.
Meg Zalatel.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. And actually, Barbara, the next one's the informal one, but that's totally fine. So for folks who want to get into the queue, feel free to either put yourself in the chat, or if you can't access the chat, text me. And that's how assembly members can get in the queue. So we're going to go ahead and turn it over to the administration for their presentation and discussion on the ordinance, and then we'll go into questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Jason Bockenstedt, Chief of Staff for the Mayor, and I believe Kate Vogel is also on, or should be. She will also be helping with the discussion and answering questions. Don't have a formal presentation as we have typically had in the past, but I do want to share the AM, so let me do that. What I thought I would do is start with the back half of this ordinance first, and see if there are any questions that members have before we get into what I believe the meat of this is. So the back half, in case there are any questions, is as a result of receiving this money and putting it into a low interest bearing account, we believe that there will be some amount of interest that we earn, and we are looking at being able to appropriate an amount not to exceed $75,000 through first responder payroll as well. And then the other kind of small amount that was associated with this is when we initially put the $156 million forward, the 4 cents that went along with it was not included. So we are also looking at attaching the additional 4 pennies that we will receive. So that is, I think, the relatively simple aspect of this ordinance, but I wanted to touch on that first and see if anyone had any questions about those aspects before we kind of moved on. Okay, hearing none, I will move on and kind of discuss what it is that we're doing and why we are doing it. I think as everyone on the body is well aware, when AR 2020-271S was passed as amended, there were a number of items that were put in the hold column. We are approving these, but put them in the hold column until the administration has had an opportunity to talk to the decision makers within the Treasury Department. So shortly after that resolution was passed, Kate Vogel and myself set up a call and a meeting with individuals at the Treasury Department that included Daniel Kowalski, who's one of the counselors to the Secretary of the Treasury, and Stephen Milligan, who's a Deputy Assistant General Counsel at the Treasury Department, to discuss a whole range of topics, to include the acquisition of the properties that were approved in AO 2020-66, along with some of the different programs that were approved within 2020-271. So as you can see, and hopefully everyone has had an opportunity to look through the AM that was attached. We spent a lot of time hopefully putting a lot of the information in there. And I'll highlight just a couple of different items. The first was the conversation around the acquisition of properties and the use of CARES Act funds. And I want to just highlight again that the Treasury Department again told us that the acquisition of properties is an allowable use. It's an eligible use of CARES Act funds, and that any property that is acquired, the government that is acquiring them may keep them after the funding period, which within the CARES Act is December 30th. I think, as we have described as well, one of the new items that was mentioned to us by the Treasury Department that had not been written down at all within any of the FAQs was that in addition to actually acquiring any property for services in the area of homelessness, in addition to that, you also had to be providing the services to the individuals by December 30th. And while certainly there is still the hope that at least for one of the buildings that we can meet that deadline, I think as we have described, the Alaska Club is going to take a little bit longer because of the necessary renovations there. So what really happened at that point was we switched to the conversation around one of the aspects that has been in the FAQs that Treasury has put out for quite a bit, and that is the simpler option. And I say simpler option as that was the description that the folks at the Treasury Department, how they described it, which is the simpler option for local governments is to spend the funding that we received on first responder payroll. And as was described, and we have described within the AM, the Treasury Department was somewhat confused that governments and local jurisdictions like ours wasn't taking advantage of this from the very beginning. And as I describe this, I'll talk about a few different issues that they raised during this. The first was that just like I think us, the Treasury Department is in the same boat in that they don't have especially the Treasury Secretary's office, they do not have a never-ending supply of staff to kind of deal with a $2 trillion stimulus package. So they, as they described to us, are doing their best to figure out how local governments can spend this funding and meet all of the kind of criteria that was set within the actual underlying legislation. And they, again, I'll point out, they pointed to this simpler option of using it for first responder payroll as an administrative convenience for us, but also as an administrative convenience for them. And the reason I say that, and I think the reason why they said that, is no one at the Treasury Department has had experience kind of administering this type of program. That's not what their expertise is in. So they are trying to figure out ways to make it easier for them, both on the accounting side, but also for local governments across the country. And the one particular area that we had some conversation about in terms of an actual program was around the jobs programs. And we described what we were doing with that, and that we had spent a lot of time looking into this, and that it was our view that it would be better to actually put somebody to work for a period of time that was either laid off, furloughed, or had their hours reduced at their full-time job. And the response that we received from the Treasury was, as a conservative, I absolutely love what you're trying to do there. That makes a lot of sense to us. But as a bureaucrat, I would have some additional questions. And it wasn't in the sense of additional questions that we don't like it, but that what they are trying to do with these FAQs are be broad enough to inform governments across the country. And they don't want to get into a situation where they're having to put together 700 different questions for each different program that local governments across the country are trying to do and use. So again, they came back to, if you just use this simpler option, you're okay on our end, you're okay on your end, and you have the added benefit of being able to free up general local government dollars. And ultimately, we want anything that you guys spend to be something that you would otherwise support on your local level. And the kind of rationale they use for that is, we don't want governments around the country using this one-time federal money for things that you wouldn't otherwise support. And I think as we walked through kind of the process that we went through, the very public process that we went through to get to each of these allocations, I think it became very apparent to them that we had done a good job of going through that process and tying it to priorities that we had at the local level. So again, they brought it back and said, well, it seems like because you guys are already willing and have gone through a process that you have local support for these, that again, this just seems like a simpler option for you and for us. And then I think the final thing before I ask Kate if she has any additional comments on this is to say that during our conversation, they did say that there was going to be updated guidance to essentially address some of the issues around the first responder payroll, questions that they had received to help clarify. And shortly after, within about 10 days, the Treasury Department did issue supplemental guidance. And again, I think we copy and pasted word for word that guidance within the AM. But again, I think it significantly aligns with the conversation that we had. We certainly received a positive response from Treasury to our summarizing of our phone call, but this is what we're looking at doing. I will say on the substance, there's zero change between anything that the Assembly passed in regards to dollar amounts or programs. They are word for word and dollar for dollar the same amount. We have made no changes to either of those items within this ordinance. But I will turn it over to Kate to see if she has anything to add, if I've missed anything in terms of our conversation with Treasury, and then we'll be happy to answer questions that members have.
Thanks, Jason. This is Kate Vogel, municipal attorney, and I think Jason correctly encapsulated both the conversations that we had with Treasury and Treasury's latest guidance, as well as what we're accomplishing here in this AO. So I'm ready for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mr. Balkenstad and Ms. Vogel. So I'll go ahead and start going through the queue. First, I have Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, if this money is moved into first responder payroll, how are we going to track it as to the particular projects that we've identified for funding with regard to, fund balance existing in the general operating budget. So in a nutshell, how do we not lose track of the funds to ensure that they are subsequently spent as indicated in the current appropriations?
I will take a first crack at that question, and I think either Lance or Alex are also on. So if I get anything wrong, I may ask them to supplement my answer. But the way that we have still set this up is that there will be a particular grant fund that is set up where each of these will still be tracked individually in terms of dollar amount and what we're spending them on. And then certainly I think the other piece that I would say is that just like with some of the other programs that are rolling out, we have kept the Assembly abreast in our weekly report to the Assembly on what the dollar amount that's been spent to date. So I think those two areas will cover it, but I will ask Alex to correct me if I'm wrong on that. There will still be a particular fund within kind of our coding side of things that will track each of these individually as well.
Yes, through the chair, Jason has got it correct. The only thing I would add is that for each one of these programs, there's also a separate grant agreement that goes hand in hand where the entity that we're working with that may be helping us to push the funds into the community understands their obligation to distribute completely by December 30th and to report back to us. But Jason has said it correctly.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Well, thanks. So, this is just fairly quickly, essentially the whole list of expenditures. And I wonder, do we need to send them all through this routine or a lot of these things will be handled and done by the end of the year. Can we keep those kind of along the normal, nothing really quite normal, but the originally anticipated routine, and then only those things that need a delay would use this public safety roundabout way? Thanks.
I think that there is certainly that opportunity. I will say that because we are already very close to October, I think our preference would be to continue to do it this way, so that we don't necessarily run into any, if there is some sort of unforeseen circumstance that we run into where it causes one or these programs that we think might be completed by December 30th to not be. We don't want to get into a situation where some of that funding is at risk. So I think our preference would still be to keep all of the programs that have been identified, in this, and keep them allocated this way. But Kate might have I don't know if she has a different view than that of me.
Yes, through the chair, if I could add to that, I would just say the way that we chose what should make this list was either projects where there was some element where we were worried about a December 30th deadline, or where there wasn't an FAQ as directly as on point to the type of project that we were having as we would like. So the two concerns that we are dealing with is that Treasury could subsequently speak about the sort of program that we have and just add more details or conditions that we do not know about right now. In other words, some concern about eligibility that we don't see right now because Treasury is speaking, when it does speak, very specifically in its FAQ answers. And so it's just sort of, okay, these don't have a clear model in the FAQ. And then the other, and maybe it's the majority of the list, is there's some element of timing when we originally were putting together the list, we were looking only at the statutory requirements with respect to timing, and that was that the money be spent by December 30th. After our conversation with Treasury, where it was apparent that it was not just enough for the money to be spent, at least with respect to capital projects, they also wanted the user group that the capital project was intended for to be receiving the benefit by December 30th. So, in the case of a Girdwood Health Clinic, for example, that would mean not just building it, but having it actually operational. And that's different from just spending the money on building. So those were how this list came about. And because I think we're still presenting the people of Anchorage with, this is a package of how the community, through municipal funds, through federal dollars, is responding to COVID-19. I think that commitment remains true, whether or not the money goes, the CARES Act money goes to payroll, and then it's municipal dollars going to the particular project.
Okay. Well, thanks. And I guess this isn't all the money, so I hadn't quite grasped that. I think the only one, I think the 9-star, I mean, that seems like a pretty simple one too, is you have 3 months to give the grant. But no, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I absolutely appreciate the fact that the administration has, gone to the extent of separating out these different projects and really making sure that the ones that are going to be funded through the COVID relief funds are the ones that we know the Treasury Department has said, you can do it. You can do this. So I think that was wise. My question is more in regard to kind of the mechanics now of the fund balance and how we appropriate any funds for any project that is on the list that supposedly will come from the new monies that should be in the fund balance. To me, I think there's a real big difference between the COVID funds versus fund balance. The COVID funds, that's a known entity. That's a certain source of funds that we have. The fund balance, on the other hand, and this is kind of typical of fund balance, is it's kind of an unknown. It's an uncertain. It really isn't known until the end of the year, when the entire year's budget is trued up, and then we have this pot of money, could be large or small, that basically puts us in a whole other process of determining where that money should go. So this is probably a question for Alex, or maybe for Lance, just in regard to how the fund balance process works, because to me, this triggers an entirely new process when we're talking about how we would use fund balance, and the fact that now we have a period by which we have to wait in order for us to actually know what that fund balance is. We can project that, but because it's a process by which it happens at the end of the budget season, now we have to wait to make sure we actually have that money. So can somebody speak to that, please? Thanks.
Through the chair, Ms. Kennedy, this is Alex. I'm going to ask Lance to talk a little bit about the budget process, and then I can talk a bit about how we will mechanically arrive at a calculation of available funds to spend.
Thank you, Alex. Assemblymember Kennedy, this is Lance Wilbur, Director of OMB. I think Assemblymember Kennedy has, brought out the point that this, in fact, it would generate a fund balance by moving these dollars over. But I think, as Jason mentioned earlier, the commitment of the use of the fund balance, the amount of, the 60 million, 61 million, or whatever the number would be. I mean, we've already sort of programmed the allocation and purpose of that fund balance, whether it be the fund balance dollars or the CARES dollars. So we've already made a commitment to move forward on those programs, at least to the point where, that's the intent of the administration and the Assembly. Since we will be able to identify, the dollar amount of the fund balance that would be generated by moving this public safety labor over, we can account for that through our budgeting process. And then at the year end, Assemblymember Kennedy is right. As we close 2020, outside the addition of these dollars into fund balance, just the regular budgeting process of revenues and expenses, we won't know what the day-to-day operations outside the COVID are until the end of the year. We are making some, at least on for 2020, we've asked departments to give us their projections of their spend, and all of that will be part of our 2021 budget submission. But right now, we're working on the premise for 2021 budget, unless the administration of the Assembly has directed us to apply these CARES COVID funds to projects or programs in 21. That fund balance dollar through this process will not be included in the 21 budget. It will be separate. And to reiterate what Alex mentioned earlier and Jason started, is that the ability to track what we are spending these dollars on, whether they be CARES or they be fund balance for particular purposes, we have to report that to the grantor, and then the agencies receiving the dollars have to report to us. So, I mean, we've got a lot of tracking involved, both internally and externally. So, Assemblymember Kennedy, I hope that answered your question.
Can I follow up on that, Mr. Chair?
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it answers part of my question, but I guess I'm looking for a real definitive answer in terms of when we can actually use fund balance, because right now the fund balance number is a projection. It's not a known number. And we won't know that number. I mean, we can kind of say, well, yeah, we're offsetting by this amount. So we would typically think that we should have that amount. But fund balance is not a known number until the end of the year, when the entire budget is trued up, when all the expenses are paid, when all the unexpended funds are calculated, then we know what those funds are. So are we saying then that the projects that are on that list for use of fund balance money will not be implemented or paid for, or funds will not go out until after we actually know that number of fund balance? In other words, after we've trued up the budget, so sometime after December 31st.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if the Assembly approves this movement of basically paying public safety labor, those, the budget of that is tax dollars. We cover those expenses with CARES funds that will free up those tax dollars and make them available for all of the programs on that list. And if they are to be implemented in 2020, we will use those dollars to implement those programs in 2020 to the amount that the Assembly is appropriating in this AR. It will not slow down any commitments that we have to nonprofits or to small businesses or to any other plans or programs until we actually have a final fund balance calculation. I mean, it will not do that.
Okay, thank you. All right, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got 3 questions, comments, and the first one is a quick one, I think, on page 3, section 6, and it shows 4 cents of CARES Act funds being appropriated as a grant. So I was curious about that one. And then the second question just has to do, more generally speaking, with the expectation of some members of the public that concerning the first responder payroll, there needs to be alignment with the actual costs that first responders have spent on COVID-19 related issues and the amount that is of CARES Act money that's being used. And so my question in regards to that expectation is, what section of the guidance would you point to that makes it clear that you don't need to have that one-to-one correlation between actual time spent by first responders on COVID-19 issues and the amount transferred. So that's the second one. And then the third one is more just a comment to what other members have brought up about accounting and the 18 million in revenue gap, especially from tourism and other areas like the motor fuels tax that's COVID driven, and how this will fit into the accounting and appropriations, given that some members of the public see this as just trying to get around the rules, since it's not an appropriate use to replace revenue. So just quickly recap, the 4 cents in section 6, expectations of the public for alignment between actual costs and amount of first responder payroll. And then third, just the issue of revenue replacement and that $18 million gap. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Through the chair,
Through the
Assembly
chair.
France,
Okay.
I'll take the first one real quick, and then maybe Kate can take the second, and then we'll maybe all of us will take a portion of the third. But the first, as I mentioned at the very beginning, was the 156 million when it was originally received did not include the 4 cents. So we received 156 million, I think $718.04. So this is just our attempt to account for and appropriate the 4 cents in that 156 million that has not been accounted for to date. And I'll let Kate maybe take the question number 2.
Oh, thanks for repeating that, Jason. I had missed that in the beginning. Appreciate it.
Okay, through the chair, this is Kate Vogel. And to answer your question, Assemblymember LaFrance, this was something that we directly asked Treasury about in the conversation. So because most CARES Act funds, you need to show that the particular item was not previously budgeted for, and that it's substantially different use, or rather substantially different use of the thing can also equate to not previously budgeted for. So we just sort of asked directly, as Treasury was really pointing us to, hey, for small programs in particular, we don't know why local communities are contorting themselves and aren't using this administrative accommodation. We said, well, just to be clear, what does that mean if we already had budgeted for the payroll of those individuals? And does this presumption still apply that yes, covering that payroll is acceptable? And we put that right into the letter that we wrote to Treasury, because their answer was yes, the legal presumption, and it's an administrative accommodation is the other way that they have referred to it, applies even if we are budgeting for police officers that were already budgeted for, because it's this targeted group of public safety. So the one place to point the public is this email and paragraph, the email that we sent to Treasury and that they confirmed encapsulated the conversation, which says, this is a presumptively eligible expense. It's paragraph 2 of that email that we sent, and it's included, quoted in the AM. Spending on payroll for frontline and public-facing public safety and public health employees is permitted, and such use of coronavirus relief funds may have the side effect of freeing up municipal general funds that would otherwise have paid those salaries. And we wrote, in other words, the legal presumption allows governments to use CRF on this payroll, even if the government had previously budgeted to pay those same individuals with municipal funds. The second place where Treasury has spoken, you asked about where should you point people specifically. On September 2nd, 2020, the Treasury Department issued supplemental guidance on the use of CARES Act funds to cover payroll. And that further confirmed that the use of CARES Act funds to cover the payroll costs of public health and public safety workers is an allowable and administratively convenient way to spend the monies. And we quote those two lines. I think it's on your screen right now. These are direct quotes. It's two paragraphs that were added into the Treasury guidance on September 2nd, 2020. It's consistent with what our understanding of the payroll expense allowance had been ahead of time. It's consistent with the conversation that we had. It just spells out and details a little bit more about which employees they mean. The way Treasury talked to us about this in our conversation was to say, you know, one of the things that that Treasury is interested in seeing is that governments use this money to cover this payroll. So rather than, you know, choosing to address any economic difficulties through layoffs to this particular sector, you now have this infusion of federal money that can be used to pay this sector. So it's not tied to, for these individuals, it's not tied to having to document or show, you know, hour for hour, what are they doing? How is it different? They have created an administrative accommodation that permits this presumption, and they've directed us to use it. So I'd say those are the two specific sort of pieces of language from Treasury. One is an email that we wrote to Treasury that they confirmed back was an accurate summation of the conversation. And the other is the two paragraphs that Treasury included in that guidance.
And
so I think that was
if
the second question. You might have had a third. Yeah, go for it, Jason.
Yeah, and I would just point out again that the dates also, I think, are extremely important that they also mention, because they don't necessarily directly line up with when the CARES Act was passed. So there's some retroactivity that happens. And again, we put it in the AM, it's in the FAQs, but the dates that we have to work with in terms of spending this on first responder payroll are the dates of March 1st, 2020 through December 30th, 2020. So we couldn't pay for payroll expenses that were from January or February, but anything the rest of the year, they have provided that these dates are the acceptable kind of dates in which you should calculate what your payroll is for your first responders. And then if you could repeat your third question, I think I've forgotten it since we've answered the first two.
Thanks. That's really helpful, Jason and Kate. The third one mostly was just if you would comment about the $18 million revenue gap and covering it with fund balance that has been made available because of the payroll, first responder payroll costs that have been covered. And you know, and how some members of the public see this as getting around the rules concerning revenue replacement. And if you could just talk a little bit more about that piece.
Sure. I think the answer is very similar to, I think, everything else that we have said in all of the different programs, which is to say that what Treasury told us was that, you know, by doing it this way, you were freeing up otherwise already budgeted or allocated general fund dollars to do with as your governing body in Anchorage wants to do with it. And I will say that one of the other pieces of the conversation that we had with Treasury around this particular issue was that you know, the big thing that they wanted to also prevent as a result of providing this more administrative convenience was that you know, local governments around the country, including state governments as well, would have the necessary funds to ensure that they did not have to lay off any first responders. So I think the same rules apply in that, you know, what they are wanting us to do is free up the general dollars that we have, and spend them in the way that our local government through its public processes to appropriate money and put money out on the street through its procurement processes, that we are following those, and that's essentially what we're trying to do. But I'll also let Kate jump in and say anything additional on that, and if Alex maybe has anything as well.
Yeah, this is Kate. I don't have anything to add, so if Alex does, that's fine by me.
Through the chair, I would just affirm what Jason has said, that the Treasury is giving us this guidance, and it's very clear we can spend the money that it has been that this transfer allows under the rules we normally follow. And so, I think it's what we've said is we are doing what the Treasury says we can do.
And one aspect that I do kind of want to address is a way that you kind of asked the question that I think I've heard from others, is that somehow we are using a loophole to get around this. And I would just respond to that by saying, I guess from my perspective, I don't see it as a loophole. Like this is exactly what the Treasury Department has told us that they would prefer us to do. So I would certainly understand if we had never had a conversation with Treasury and never have gone through this process, and all of a sudden we came up and said, well, this is what we're going to do. That, yes, accuse us of using a loophole. But I don't think that's what we're doing, because they have issued specific guidance on this specific issue and said, do it this way. So in my mind, that isn't a loophole. That's the actual rule we're following.
Thank you all. That's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. I just want to riff a little bit on the point that Ms. Kennedy was trying to make about fund balance. My understanding is that we fund all of our programs off of the anticipation of revenue and the balancing of the budget. And so I don't understand how this would be any different than funding directly those budget lines. And so it doesn't seem to me like there's any argument that we need to wait until the end of the year to fund all of these things, because we fund it in the exact same manner that we would have funded the line that these funds are no longer needed for. Is that a correct analysis?
Through the chair, my answer to that would be yes, but I will also let Alex or Lance respond too.
Thank you, Mr. Assemblymember Constant. I was on mute, so I said the same thing that Jason did. And that, just to reiterate, remember, we are tracking these dollars into we're tracking the purpose of the use of these dollars separate than we are from regular general government purposes. So I would agree with Mr. Constant. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Allard?
Thank you. So I wanted to go back to what Jason was saying about a loophole with the federal government. By definition, this is a loophole because the federal government, apparently what you're saying is advised you to do it these ways. And the mayor himself also said that he was going to use unorthodox ways to use the CRF in the way that you guys wanted to. So my concern is that if we're using these ways as a loophole to move money that we already budgeted for and move it over to use it as the CRF funded, why wouldn't we take the projects that we have listed, the trails, the weatherization, or rural cap weatherization, the medical clinic, and all these? If they're so legitimate and it's benefiting the communities, then we should be taking those dollars straight out of the CRF. That's why I believe that the public is upset about it, and that's why they're bringing it to my attention. because we are backdooring it and we're spending the money in a way that if it was all above board, we would be using the CRF to do it. The other thing is, it was clearly stated in the email. Yes, I saw the second paragraph where they said, hey, this is the way you can use the federal government's funds, and here's the loophole, and here's the way we can do it. But the other thing that was also commented on was that the hotels that we were purchasing needed to be a necessity. If they were a necessity, then we would be using the CRF to purchase those buildings. So when we're putting out information to the public, we have to quote the entire context, because if you don't, it is deceiving. And the perception is that they won't trust us. So I just want to make sure that when you're saying we're not using a loophole, we are. And the mayor even said it, unorthodox. And that is what we're doing. And I believe that. And I just want that to be put out there.
I mean, I don't really have a response other than to say that I disagree with that characterization, and we're following the rule, not the loophole, the rule that the Treasury Department has put out through their FAQ.
Thank you. I don't see anyone else in the queue. I'll go ahead and open it up one last time to see if there's any further discussion. Otherwise, we'll end early. Okay, see no further discussion then. I'm going to go ahead and close this work session. I'll see everyone again at 11 o'clock. Thanks, everyone.